Good evening, everyone. I am Peggy Edersheim-Kalb. I'm president of the Library Board of Trustees, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Greenwich Library's Signature Series. This series offers dynamic, exceptional public programming that engages the Greenwich community and region, featuring nationally recognized experts for timely analysis and conversations that promote an exchange of ideas. This series is made possible through the support of the Greenwich Library Board of Trustees and contributions by generous donors. A few reminders: please turn off or mute your cell phone and refrain from using it and taking any photos during the event. There will be a Q&A following the talk. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and wait for someone to bring you a microphone. Books will be available for purchase in the lobby following the event, thanks to Diane's books. Now, I am delighted to welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Leonhardt for a discussion about his book, Ours Was the Shining Future, The Rise and Fall of the American Dream. David is senior writer at the New York Times, where he writes the morning newsletter. He's also been the Times Washington bureau chief, an op-ed columnist, a staff writer for the Times Magazine, in addition to being the founding editor of The Upshot, a site published by the Times that combines journalistic analysis with data visualization. Jacob Weisberg is the co-founder and CEO of Pushkin Industries. He was CEO of the Slate Group, co-founder of Megaphone, and editor-in-chief of Slate Magazine. He has written for publications including the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Financial Times. He is author of several books and a lecturer at Yale University, chair of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and a member of the Penn Board. Having known both of them for decades, in fact, I think Jacob and I go back about 40 years, I am particularly pleased to welcome them to our stage. Please join me in welcoming David Leonhardt and Jacob Weisberg.
Thanks so much, Peggy. Peggy is indeed an old and dear friend. We go back to the college paper where she did all the work and I kind of rode her coattails. It's wonderful to be here in this lovely library with one of my favorite journalists, David Leonhardt. And if you want a little more of a plug, the morning newsletter is how I navigate the New York Times. And what I love about it is the incredibly useful synthesis you get. If you spend 5 to 10 minutes, you start your day really informed, and you get these little essays David does. Not every day, but when he gets interested in something, he kind of sneaks it in at the top. And boy, have I learned a lot reading him in The Upshot and the morning newsletter, and now in this incredibly interesting book. So congratulations, David.
Thank you, Jacob. It's wonderful to be here. This might be the nicest library I've ever seen, as we were discussing. So thank you for having both of us.
I want to start. This is a book about what happened to the American dream. And I do think it's important, before we get too far into the discussion, to have some definition of what the American dream is. I've heard a lot of different ones. What's yours?
So mine is, I go back to the beginning, and at one point in the book I say this is meant to be a biography of the American dream. And I think of that as the American dream like a celebrity or a person from history. Everyone's heard of the American dream, but I actually think relatively few people know the backstory of it. And if you look through old newspapers, you'll occasionally, before 1931, see the words American and dream next to each other, but it was almost accidental. It wasn't the version that we mean today. The version that we mean today was founded in 1931, coined in 1931, by a historian named James Truslow Adams. It was a short book, thematic history of the United States, called The Epic of America. And he said that the United States' most important contribution to world culture was the American dream, and he defined it as that dream of a better, happier, richer life for all of our citizens of every rank. And I actually still think a version of that is the best definition that there is. I know some people think of it particularly about home ownership or immigration, but those both fit under this larger definition. And to me, when you think about his definition, better, richer, happier life, implicit in that is the idea of progress, right? Better than before, better than your parents, your kids better than you. And the fact that he laid out the idea of for all citizens of every rank, it embeds the notion of social mobility. And the final thing that I find so remarkable about it is he wrote the book in 1931. I mean, it's not exactly happy times, right? Today we think of the American dream as something that, politicians say it's almost like too sunny. He wrote it during the Depression, and yet he had a basic confidence that this was the signature American idea, or a signature American idea.
So if we take that as a working definition, an economic definition, essentially, that says children are going to have a better life than their parents, and that can include going to college if their parents didn't, owning a home if their parents didn't, having a better standard of living than their parents didn't. I think you say in the book that now only half of children growing up in America can anticipate that being true.
Correct.
In economic groups. But I just want to press a little on that. How do we know that, and how and when did it change?
So I'm not an academic. I'm not an economist. I'm a journalist. But I work with a lot of economists, and I've spent many years talking to them. And there's a team of economists based at Harvard that have been doing this incredible research with tax returns, where they've really gotten a better look at how much people actually earn than we've ever had before. In the past, we had to rely on surveys. People aren't that good at remembering how much they earned last year, let alone 10 years ago, right? And people are hard to track down year after year. But tax returns are really not that hard. They have good memories, and they're easy to track down if you get access to them, and they have anonymized, but they can still connect people. And so they produced this quite complex measure, and I said to the economists, I understand why you've produced this complicated version of it, but could you just tell us what percentage of kids make more money than their parents and how that's changed over time? I could not do that. I'm not an economist. But they tied these tax returns to census records, and they were able to do it. And they, doing all the controls you would do, you adjust for inflation, you compare parents and kids at similar age, and they determined that 92% of Americans born in 1940, so those are people who today are in their early 80s, 92% of them grew up to earn more money as adults than their parents had at the same age, which means that achieving the American dream, as I just defined it, was a virtual guarantee, right? Many of these people suffered a layoff at some point in their life. Maybe they got divorced, maybe they had a major health problem, and nonetheless, 92%. And then as they carry that forward, it goes down a little bit for people born in 1950, and it keeps going down. And by the time you get to people born in 1980, who were really the last cohort where we have enough earnings definition, they have enough earnings data to look at it, for them it's a 50-50 proposition. And we can get into it. I would argue that even if you think that one study, even if that one study is not enough to persuade you, I think there is a wealth of other evidence that points in the same direction.
And something changed in the 1970s.
Yes.
When instead of diminishing, inequality started to increase. Is that, do the economists you talk to agree that that was the sea change, that was when we went from this period where increasing prosperity was widely shared to a period in which it's much more narrowly shared, that is, the gains accrue much more to the top of the income scale and don't necessarily help the working class?
I think that there are actually two important changes. I think the change in the 1970s was the slowdown of economic growth. And then I think the real increase in inequality is actually more a story that starts in the 1980s. So if we think of the economy as a pie, the pie stops growing as rapidly in the 70s, and then it starts becoming divided more unequally in the 80s. And the reason I separate those two is it's as if I timed my book for it, which is it's a complete coincidence. The 50th anniversary of the Arab oil embargo was last week. And it came shortly after the start of the Yom Kippur War, which was, and I think that's really the moment where the American economy slows. If you look at the data, you can see 1973 in the data. Inflation surged so much after the Arab oil embargo, and the oil countries realized after it, even after the specific fight that led to the Arab oil embargo ended, the oil companies realized, oh, wait a second, we have all this power, we can keep prices higher. So they basically kept them high in the 70s, and then the revolution in Iran was another oil shock. that really slowed economic growth because it was like a massive tax increase on all Americans. And then, but inequality doesn't really start rising rapidly. It's just kind of everyone's doing less well. And then in the 1980s, that's when almost any set of data you look at, you see inequality start to soar.
Yeah. So in a minute, I want to get into the components of the change. But first, I want to talk about this period before, the post-war period until 1973, which you describe. I mean, it's hard not to be nostalgic for it reading about it. I was born in 1964, so I don't remember it very well, but a lot of it was the context of my childhood. And this was a much more consensus-oriented period, both in terms of the shared agreement and values between the two political parties, but a broad consensus among corporate America,
Yes.
labor, and government about certain things. Describe that period a little bit, because I was really struck by your evocation of it.
So one of the figures in my book is Paul Hoffman, who's the CEO of Studebaker, and who's extremely conservative. I mean, he helps campaign against FDR in all 4 of FDR's campaigns. He has incredibly critical things to say about the New Deal. He's really conservative. He rose up as a car salesman, and then he became an executive at Studebaker. And yet he embodies and plays a real evangelical role in persuading other corporate executives. He gets very worried in the 40s. He thinks, fascism is on the march in Europe, communism is on the march in Europe. Many people are turning away from democracy and from capitalism. We need to demonstrate that capitalism works for most people. We need to demonstrate that capitalism can deliver better results than totalitarianism can. And he basically, looking at the high inequality period of the 20s and the Depression, decides that the US economy should move away from this low-wage, high-profit economy to a high-wage, high-profit economy. And he himself doesn't cause this change to happen, right? He is symbolic of something larger, but he helps found this group called the Committee for Economic Development that spends World War II basically trying to persuade CEOs, A, to be optimistic about the post-war period, not to assume we're going to lapse back into a depression, and B, to create a higher wage economy and then let those wages flow back into profits. People often think of it as Henry Fordism, but actually Henry Ford is not the best avatar of it. Henry Ford kept wages down a lot. And I don't think, so these were corporate executives, they were still conservative in many ways, they didn't love labor unions, but they still took a more patriotic, I would argue that patriotic is a fair word, and more moderate approach to the economy. They didn't try to crush labor unions, they tried to beat them in negotiations. They accepted extremely high marginal tax rates. They didn't try to get rid of the antitrust laws. They basically were willing to work within this system. And that culture really changes over time. In some ways, I think as good an example of it as Paul Hoffman is George Romney, because I think both George Romney and his son Mitt are deeply admirable figures. Whether you agree with them on all politics or whatever disagreements you have, I would argue they're both very admirable figures. They both had a career in business before they became Republican politicians. George Romney voluntarily returned a bonus, as I tell the story, because he thought it was unseemly to earn that much more than his workers when he was the CEO in Detroit. Mitt Romney never voluntarily returned any bonuses. I don't think Mitt is inherently a worse person than George, or even inherently a more selfish person than George. They existed in different cultures, and that culture of the post-war years, which obviously had a ton of problems we can talk about, but it was a more patriotic, more communitarian, less self-seeking corporate culture than we have now.
It seems kind of incredible. I mean, what was George Romney's salary in the 1950s?
Yeah, the ceiling was something like $100,000 or $200,000, and so you inflation adjusted, and I think we're talking about a couple million. It's not that much money relative to...
Relative to CEO salaries
Yeah.
now, and if you viewed it in terms of a multiple of a assembly line worker, it would have been what, 10 times?
Yeah, I mean, nothing
as
like it.
opposed to 100 times or 200 times.
Yeah.
And the top marginal tax rate, which he would have paid through the 1950s, was 90%.
90%.
And it was not part of Republican politics to challenge that.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Dwight Eisenhower gets elected in 1952, takes office in 1953, first Republican president in 20 years, very much a creature of corporate America. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower is a war hero, but he is the candidate of corporate America, the Republican candidate of corporate America. And yeah, he doesn't come in and he tries to repeal like a little excess profits tax that Truman had put in during the war. He does not go after the top marginal tax rate. And people say, well, no one actually paid that tax rate. First of all, some people did pay it. But second of all, some people didn't pay it through tax avoidance. But another reason people didn't pay it is they didn't fight to earn that much money because they knew they'd pay the 90% tax rate.
Right.
So to some extent, part of what the 90% tax rate does is it reduces inequality even before it happens. And I'm not saying 90% is the right tax rate. It's almost certainly too high, but we're not anywhere near 90% today.
I mean, but the culture shift is astonishing. I don't think Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren thinks the top rate should be 90%.
No, that's right.
And then you had the leading Republicans who didn't think that it shouldn't be 90%. So
Yes.
how did that happen?
So culture is very hard to sort of put your finger on. But what I think happened is that I think that we had in this country a corporate leadership that had been forged by the Depression and by the war and by the Cold War. These were existential threats to the American economy and this country. And I think that did produce, as I was saying, a less self-seeking culture. And then the United States is incredibly successful through the 50s and through the 60s and even into the 70s. And some of that fear starts to dissipate. And you then have two things coming together. One, you have the rise of a conservative intellectual movement. Milton Friedman's is the best known member of it. But I spend more time on Robert Bork because I think Bork is really important, and he's now just remembered as a failed Supreme Court nominee, as opposed to a truly important intellectual for his ideas about the economy and antitrust policy. And these intellectuals have been saying all along that the post-New Deal consensus is wrong. And they are saying we should be moving toward a laissez-faire economy. It'll be better for everyone. Sure, the economy's been okay, but it can be much better. And really, no one listens to them. I mean, they keep losing and losing and losing. They lose elections and referendum into the early 70s. There's an anti-tax referendum in Michigan in the early 70s that Milton Friedman campaigns for. It goes down in a landslide. But then the oil embargo happens, and the 1970s stagflation happens. And Americans look around and they say, wait a second, this system isn't working. And they basically are open to trying something new. And these conservatives have spent decades building an argument, and they were ready for their moment. And they seized the moment with the election of Ronald Reagan. And I want to say that in the moment, I don't think it was an implausible theory that they had, right? They tended to really downplay, to the point of it being a little bit dishonest, the importance of the Arab oil embargo. But they were saying, look, the government spent too much money in the 60s. It was doing both anti-poverty and the Vietnam War, and it sparked inflation. And if we just get the government out of the way, everything will be great. And they were able to implement a huge number of their policies, and they made a bunch of promises. We're going to implement these policies. We're going to cut taxes. We're going to cut regulation. We're going to let companies grow really big, and it's going to be better for everyone. And that was their diagnosis, and that was their treatment. And part of what I try to do is now compare the reality that followed with the promises that they made.
Yeah. So, I mean, you talk about, I made a little list here of some of the factors that have drove the change, that are responsible for the growing inequality and the decline of the American dream you talk about. And I wanted to ask you to maybe give me some sense of which you think are the most important
Okay,
ones. And
that's
so I'll
fine.
just, and I'm not going to list all the ones you talk about in the book, but they include immigration,
Yep.
increase in American immigration, the decline of investment, both public investment and corporate R&D type investment, the decline of unions, which is something you talk about a lot, and I want to talk about that whether you think it's at the top of the list or not. The rise of global free trade and free trade is policy here, rising crime, decline of public education, including state university education, and deregulation. So that's a lot. You don't have to stack rank them exactly, but give me a sense of which are the most important in your view.
So I would put in the top tier the decline in investment, and the stagnation of education, and the decline of labor unions. And I'm not sure I would put any of the others in the top tier with those.
Investment, unions, and education. Okay, so let's talk about those in order. Well, I want to hit on immigration too, but let's talk about the investment thing.
Yeah,
because that's really interesting. What in numerical terms, when did government start spending less on infrastructure? Why did it start spending less, and how much less did it spend?
The peak is Eisenhower, and I think that's really important, right? Again, Eisenhower, not under a Democrat, not under LBJ or Truman. The peak, actually, in fairness, it's Eisenhower policies. I think the number may have peaked in the early 60s.
Right.
But Eisenhower puts in place a massive increase in federal R&D, in science. And
you're talking about the interstate highway system too.
Yes. Yeah. So actually, the statistic I was just talking about doesn't even include the interstate highway system. It's just it's research and development. So yes, it's R&D. It's Eisenhower makes big investments in science education in part because of Cold War fears and Sputnik. The interstate highway system. And then it's not just Eisenhower personally, although I do think he personally plays a big role here. I mean, Eisenhower as a young man is part of an army caravan, I tell this story in the book, that crosses the country in 1919 to advocate for better roads. And basically he sees what a terrible cost the United States is paying for the fact that we just kind of had dirt roads in much of the country. And then as the somewhat accidental Allied commander in World War II, it's remarkable. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower's ascent during World War II is incredibly rapid. No one thought he would be the member of that generation leading the US troops into battle. He comes to understand that the reason he and the Allies are able to win the war is not that they have superior battle plans. It's that they just have more economic might. They can throw more tanks and more bullets and more everything into battle. And so Eisenhower really comes to internalize the importance of government can do certain kinds of investment that the private sector just won't do. And you see this huge surge during this era. It's supported on a bipartisan basis. And then, as part of the kind of laissez-faire pullback in the 1980s, you really start to see rapid declines of investment of all kinds of ways. And the way that I think most captures this is if you wake up tomorrow morning and you decide you want to fly to San Francisco or Los Angeles and you don't have a private plane at your disposal, it will take you longer to make that trip than it would have taken you to make it in the 1970s. Traffic to the airport will be worse. You will have to get to the airport much earlier than you would have back then. And the cross-country flight between New York and the West Coast is actually scheduled to be longer today than it was 50 years ago. That is a remarkable indictment of a lack of progress. That is not the case in many other countries. I'm sure many of you have traveled abroad. I've taken the trip in Shanghai from downtown Shanghai to the airport. It took 10 minutes. I think it might have taken 8 minutes. Downtown Shanghai and the airport are significantly further together than Times Square and LaGuardia Airport. And I would challenge you to get from one of those to the other in 8 minutes. And so I just think, and that's just transportation. I just think our lack of investment has had really big costs.
So you have a really interesting shift, again, if you want to map it from Eisenhower to Reagan. Eisenhower thinks that we've got to compete with the Soviets, and as after Sputnik, the U.S. could be behind. I mean, I think it was largely a fallacy, but that's what they thought. Reagan thought that if government spends too much money, we'll will turn into a socialist country because we're investing too much.
Yeah. And I want to say, Eisenhower did cut some forms of spending. The really nice thing about investment is even if you're a conservative who wants the government to do less, most of these investments aren't that expensive, right? So if you're a conservative who thinks the government should be doing less than a liberal should, the big stuff to go after is actually not these investments for the most part. It's huge benefit program. I mean, you can choose. It's the huge benefit programs. It's the military. It's stuff like that. It's not actually this kind of seed money. And just to put a fine point on it, the reason you need the government to do a lot of this early stage and infrastructure stuff is that the private sector won't do it on its own. A lot of this stuff, it's very hard to know how it will be profitable in the end. It's very hard to make a profit on this super early scientific research. A lot of the people who invented specific things don't get rich off that invention. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee is often cited as the inventor of the internet. He didn't get the returns that Jeff Bezos did, right? And so what you often need is the government to do the very early stage. And then the government should get out of the way, right? The government literally did build the internet, but it's much better to have the private sector then come in and do it. The problem is if you don't have the government doing things like educating small children, like building transportation infrastructure, like doing early stage research at the NIH, the private sector doesn't do it, and then no one does it.
Is that still completely true? I mean, I wonder about AI as an example, where there seems to be such massive private investment available, and the technology that seemed to be true from a fairly early basic research type of stage. And I'm not sure if there's an argument that the AI boom has been driven by some earlier stage of government investment the way the internet was.
So I think it's really hard to know where AI is going to go, and I think you could make a case that AI will be different and it'll be wonderful and the government doesn't need to do it. I really do, but I also think we don't know yet.
Yeah.
Let's look at social media, which is the last big technological wave. And I guess I would argue that it's clear that the private sector has done an enormous amount of investment in social media. I don't think it's clear it's benefited our society as a whole in the way that they've invested in it, right? And so if what you're interested in is early stage investment that increases GDP, I think the private sector often does do a lot of that. If what you're interested in is the kind of early stage investment that often leads to clear increases in living standards for many people, I think not all by any means, but I think the way I would put it is this way: the private sector does some of that, but left to its own devices, it leaves a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that can lead to human flourishing, and the government plays a vital role in doing a part as well.
Yeah, and why does the underinvestment drive inequality? Because as you said a minute ago, everybody suffers from it. I mean, I guess some people, maybe a few people in this room, have private planes, but if it takes 12 hours to fly coast to coast, or train trips into the city from Greenwich have gotten longer, which I'm pretty sure they have, that affects everybody.
It does. So I think a lot of this infrastructure, investment in infrastructure stuff, it does affect everybody, and that's why I would hope maybe it's a place where we could make progress. And I actually do see little bits of, as you know, I'm an optimist by nature, right? I can't help myself with my optimism. And so I do feel see some potential reasons for optimism in this country.
It's not much of an optimist title, David.
So you know something that's interesting. So Jacob, actually, if you hold that up, if you don't mind, Jacob has the galley. The last change I made to the book was I asked that we change the subhead from The Rise and Fall of the American Dream to The Story of the American Dream.
That's a big difference.
Particularly because I thought Rise and Fall was too negative. So if you want to think about a small reason for optimism on some of this investment stuff, President Biden has been the best president for investment in a long time. And if you look at his major investment bills, the ridiculously named Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually a clean energy investment bill and a healthcare bill, the semiconductor bill, and the infrastructure bill, 2 of the 3 of those got bipartisan Republican votes in an era when nothing gets bipartisan votes, right? And so I do think that investment in infrastructure is something that can be bipartisan, but I'm avoiding your question, and I don't mean to. A lack of investment hurts everybody. It really does. including very fortunate people, but it hurts the least fortunate the most. So who is hurt more when public education declines? Less fortunate people. More fortunate people can send their kids to private school, right? Most quite fortunate people send their kids to private universities as it is, right? Think about public transportation. When public transportation declines, yes, everyone suffers, but often those of us who have resources have workarounds. And so I do really think investment, it's probably mostly about the size of the pie, but it's also about the distribution of the pie.
Yeah. One of the things I really liked about this book, David, was seeing you wrestle with some issues where you're clearly somewhat conflicted and where you've changed your mind to some extent. And I think unions and immigration are both examples of that.
Yes.
I want to talk about unions a little bit because you clearly think that's centrally important, the decline in union membership from what in the post-war period above 30% of the American workforce to as low as 10% or lower. What is it now? So
yes, I don't know the number off from the top of my head because the right way to think about it is to separate the private and the public sector, but you're in the you're in the ballpark. Right. Yeah.
But we've also seen unions as in many ways a very reactionary force. Unions, don't, for the most part, the biggest American unions, don't have a positive history in terms of race. Many of them were exclusionary and effectively segregated or explicitly segregated. And you're a union member yourself. You're a member of the newspaper
Former.
guild. Oh, you're former because are you management
I'm
now?
Management now.
Yeah. But having seen unions up close, you have seen the way they can be challenging to innovation, at change, at organizations and companies that need to change.
Yes.
And that's clearly been an issue in Detroit and in industrial America. So talk a little bit about, because I would say, having read this, you are now extremely pro-union in the sense that you think the restoration of unions as a power in American politics is key to getting back to some positive outcome.
I do think
tell me about your journey on that.
And I also think as an economics writer over the last 20 years, I think I haven't written enough about unions. I think I was in a union as a reporter, and I often found it enraging, the dealing with my union representative. I mean, I had a kid who had a serious medical problem, and I went to try to go find a doctor who could help our kid, and the person I went to go talk to had an outward-facing retirement clock counting down on the desk, right? And I mean, this is someone who's supposed to be representing me, So I'm well aware of the flaws of you. And then as a manager, I've seen exactly what you just said, which is sometimes unions stand in the way of progress. The way I've come to think about it is unions are extremely flawed, and corporations are extremely flawed. And if we exist in a world where all we have is flawed corporations that are not checked by flawed unions, we end up with an extremely high inequality economy, which in fact is the economy of the United States in the 19-teens and 20s, and again today. And so I think I walk through a lot of the economic theory about why unions are important in the book. I think that the key thing to me is when you look at the empirical research, this explosion of big data, I mentioned some of the tax returns earlier, some of that same data allows economists to look at union members and otherwise similar workers over the last nearly century. And what you see is that union members make 10 to 20% more than otherwise similar union members. And that doesn't appear to come out of economic growth in most instances. It comes out of corporate profits. So it really is a shifting of the pie rather than a shrinking of the pie. And I think we see that in Detroit now. Look, unions made a terrible mistake. In the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, when unions were growing, they saw themselves as a social movement, and they some of them put enormous priority on recruiting new members. And then in the 60s and 70s, they became satisfied, self-satisfied, and they basically just put priority on protecting their own benefits. And that was bad for many of the companies they worked for, and it also meant that they shrunk. But I really think that there is nothing that can help lower income and blue-collar workers get decent wages in the way that unions can. The power imbalance between a corporation and an individual worker at, say, Starbucks or Amazon is just too big. And what we're seeing in Detroit now is an example of this. There is no way these Ford workers would be getting these raises without the union getting for them. And I know there are people who say, well, these raises are way too big for the workers. But having looked at the last century of union history, that is always what employers say about raises that workers get. They always say it's bad for the company. That doesn't mean that it is.
Right. But I mean, in the 1970s, Detroit did become uncompetitive.
Yes.
And there were a combination of factors. They weren't making the kinds of cars people wanted to buy, so design and marketing was a factor. But surely the union agreements, once they were exposed to international competition, was part of what got them in the predicament they got so deeply into.
Absolutely. There are unions that have overreached over time, some of them significantly. I tell the story of George Meany, the longtime head of the AFL-CIO in the book. He is not a hero in the book. He's an anti-hero. So there are definitely unions that have overreached. I just think when you map, I have about one chart for each chapter, and when you map the decline of union representation with inequality in this country, it just lines up extremely, extremely well. And so whether you look at the macro level, or you look at individual companies, or you look at the raises that workers get when they join unions, I just think in a basic matter of power and a balance of power, an economy without a significant union presence is an economy where blue-collar workers are really going to struggle.
But it's pretty different in the service sector versus the manufacturing sector, isn't it, because of the exposure to international trade and competition?
So it is, and that actually is a reason to be optimistic about how unions can play a larger role in our future than they have in our recent past. So if what you're saying is, well, wait a second, this factory can't really unionize because then their workers will get a nice raise, and then the factory owner should just move to non-union Alabama or non-union Latin America or non-union Asia.
Not that they should, but that they can.
That they will, right. In terms of, they have their responsibility to shareholders, right? So to keep that responsibility. That might be true, but even if that is true, a growing part of our economy are things that actually can't move to another state or another country and still do what they're doing. Think about healthcare, which is a growing part of our economy, and that's not going to change. Think about retail. Think about warehouse centers that send Amazon things. An Amazon warehouse that serves Connecticut can't move to Mexico. It literally can't, right? It's no longer an Amazon warehouse serving Connecticut anymore. And the same is true with a local Starbucks, and the same is true with all kinds of service industry businesses. And so at a time when the service sector is a growing part of our economy, I actually think that it is more possible for more of these businesses to be unionized. And to be clear, it does mean that some of their profits will be lower, and it does mean that some of their executives will make less money. But I think that a part of the problem with our economy today is that inequality is way too high. And so talking about some of that readjustment is, as they would say in Silicon Valley, a feature, not a bug.
Yeah. You have come to think that immigration plays a meaningful role in depressing working class wages. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's far lower on the list than these other factors we've talked. It's funny. So I'll just think out loud here and sort of agonize out loud, if that's okay. I think many progressives have come to claim that immigration has no costs. And I think that's wrong. I think immigration does have costs. I think the sort of xenophobic right has come to claim that immigration is terrible. And I think that's actually more wrong than what the progressives are claiming. So if the progressives are claiming immigration has no costs, it's great for everyone, everyone's wages will rise, and the xenophobic right is saying it's absolutely horrible, I'm much closer to over here. But I do think the left is wrong to say that immigration's a free lunch, which is what they say. To me, the bigger problem with immigration is not the economic, it's the political effect that immigration has. basically any society that has large-scale immigration anywhere in the world tends to move to the political right, and it makes it harder to pass progressive policies. And I think one of the big mistakes the left has made in this country is they've said, that is because of racism. You don't like immigration because you're racist. And that has a lot of truth to it. Just listen to Donald Trump. The way Donald Trump talks about immigration is racist, full stop. But every country around the world, regardless of whether the people in this country are white or of a different race, tends to be deeply uncomfortable with extremely high levels of immigration. It introduces a level of change in the country that makes people uncomfortable, and it makes voters go to the right. So I think the bigger mistake that the left has made on immigration is political, not economic. And I think it's really important to talk about how rapidly to the left the Democratic Party has moved on immigration in a very short time period. There is a long history in this country of progressives, of civil rights leaders being concerned about high levels of immigration hurting the most vulnerable workers in this country. It was true of A. Philip Randolph, it was true of Barbara Jordan, it was true of Booker T. Washington, it was true of Samuel Gompers, it was true of Bernie Sanders until recently. Barack Obama, in his 2008 acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention, said it undermines workers' wages when we have undocumented immigrants come into this country and companies can employ them without penalty. Except Barack Obama didn't use the phrase undocumented immigrants. He used a phrase that no Democrat would use today. And so Democrats have moved so far left on this issue, I'm not even sure it's left, because it's also the position that Milton Friedman has, that I just think they're not willing to grapple with the modest economic trade-offs and the very real political trade-offs. And you can't just say that anyone who wants less immigration is a bad person.
So that's it, and I'll open it up for questions in just a couple of minutes. There's one or two more to ask you myself, but that's an example of what you see as this strong divergence in view within the Democratic Party, between the college-educated, upper income, I think you refer to them as the Brahmin left, it's a good phrase, as opposed to the old Roosevelt Democrat working class base of the party. Democrats have, to a large extent, lost the working class, but they still, when they win elections, it's when they get a larger share of working class votes. The working class votes are a much larger pool than the Brahmin left, but the Brahmin left exercises a disproportionate influence on issues including immigration. How do you see that split resolving? Do you essentially think that the party should shift back to the interests of non-college educated voters and away from the cultural views of the elite that represents a big share of the party's leadership?
I think that the Democratic Party is not going to go. The Democratic Party is a party of college graduates, and that's not going to radically change. And it's not just in terms of how many votes Democrats get from college graduates, but relatively upscale college graduates. What Thomas Piketty, the economist, uses the phrase the Brahmin left that I borrow in the book. That's not going away. Those people, not that you and I would know any of them, it's not just that they vote, it's that they staff Democratic campaigns. Some of them work in the media. They staff think tanks. They're really the intellectual muscle of the Democratic Party. And parties need intellectual leadership, right? I mean, I was talking before about even if their promises didn't come true, Milton Friedman and Robert Bork provided intellectual leadership for the conservative movement. Parties need that. The problem, I think, is that the Democratic Party, or parts of it, have become not only very upscale, but often quite dismissive of the views of working class people on a long list of issues. And I think immigration is an interesting example, because I understand why Democrats often will say, the problem is that those other views are ignorant, or those other views are hateful. And some of those other views are ignorant or hateful. But I think the big mistake is there are a lot of Americans who are actually open to a range of views, who are not inherently ignorant or hateful. And telling people, having the kind of list of litmus tests that the Democratic Party, or at least the left parts of it now does, is deeply alienating. Working class people are more conservative on a long list of social issues than college graduates are. It includes guns. It includes whether schools should have reopened after COVID. It includes immigration. It includes abortion, although the Republican Party has run so far to the right on abortion that it's not a problem for the Democratic Party.
It's become a winning issue for
It's a winning
Democrats
issue.
again.
It's a winning issue, right? It was a problem for Democrats when they weren't open to any restrictions before, because most Americans are in favor of some restrictions. But now it's a Republican Party problem because they've gone so far to the right. There's such a long list of issues in which the Democratic Party has said, hey, if you disagree with us, we think you're ignorant or hateful. And first of all, I think that's bad political strategy to say you're ignorant and hateful, please vote for us. And second of all, I think it's empirically wrong. I really do. Yes, racism is a terrible, terrible problem in our society. My favorite chapter of the book might be the one in which I valorize A. Philip Randolph, the union leader. I think he's such an important figure. And when I give a short talk about the book, I just kind of tell his story. But not everything in our society is a reflection of racism. And I think when the Democratic Party says that to voters, it really turns them off. And there've just been, and it's not just these identity issues. I mean, the reason I've thought so much about COVID is because COVID's an issue that sprung out of nowhere. None of us had a background in like really strong views in COVID. And yet, large parts of the left in this country said to people, if you don't wear a mask at all times, you're killing people. If you reopen schools, you're killing people. And that really alienated voters. I'll make this the last point. I know we're going to open it up. When a progressive group did an analysis after the 2020 election to figure out why Latino voters in Texas had moved to the right. Latino voters. So this isn't just the white working class now. Asian American voters, Latino voters have moved meaningfully to the right in the last 5 years, working class. And there's a small bit of movement among black working class voters. The two issues this report highlighted were immigration. Many Latinos thought Democrats weren't serious about border security, and Latinos in Texas cared deeply about border security, and COVID. They wanted the economy to reopen, and they didn't think Democrats were putting enough emphasis on that. Maybe they're wrong, maybe they're right, but I don't think those voters are ignorant and hateful, and I think if the Democratic Party wants to, say, win Texas one of these years, it needs to build a coalition that is more open-minded and able to win more of those voters.
Reading the book, I was thinking, I wonder what politician David would think really fits this. And then it occurred to me, Joe Biden, almost 100%, almost 100%. So, I mean, you tell me whether you think Biden is pretty close to the views in the book. But the question is, if this prescription makes sense, why isn't he more popular supporting those policies?
Yeah. That actually is the hardest question for me. Not though which politician is closest to it. The politician who, in the book, I make closest to it is RFK, not Junior. RFK is remembered as this liberal hero. He was incredibly liberal on economic policy and on race. And he was actually pretty conservative on a lot of other stuff, like crime and other stuff, because he respected working class voters and he was trying to meet them where they were. He wasn't saying to them, ignore all my social positions, vote your economic interests, right? Does Greenwich vote its economic interests? No. Like lots of people don't vote their economic interests.
I think some of Greenwich does.
It's fair enough. But the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? Yeah. I've actually written a column in the New York Times about the upscale liberals called What's the Matter with Scarsdale, right? And so you can do it either way. So I think historically, I think Robert F. Kennedy. I do think today it's Joe Biden. Now, I think Joe Biden has let his party take him too far to the left on immigration. And I think there's a reason it's one of his biggest political vulnerabilities. But Biden's own interests clearly are, like every other country in the world, we should have a border we enforce. And so your question about why he isn't more popular, that's a hard question. I can take a stab at that. I don't think implementing policies that do long-term good, like investing in semiconductors, are going to make you popular tomorrow. I think inflation, which was a little bit Joe Biden's fault, but mostly not his fault, really is incredibly corrosive to the national mood. Just incredibly corrosive, more so than unemployment. Even when the unemployment rate is 10%, 90% of people are working. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that it's hard to know. I mean, he's very old. I've met with him. He's still very mentally sharp. He's also very old, right? So I'm not saying he's in mental decline, but he doesn't look like the person who I think most Americans would say we want our president to be. And we live
like RFK. Yeah.
Yeah, and we live in incredibly polarized times. But if you're saying to me, why don't you, do you know why Biden isn't more popular? I don't.
Let's open it up. We have some questions from the audience. I think there's some microphones coming around, and why don't we start right in the front row there? Yeah, great.
Asking for a friend who may be half the room or more. I have an old friend from senior actuarial at AIG, and he said, the biggest transfer of human wealth in the history of the world is about to happen. It's all these boomers. We're about to give it to our kids, particularly in this room. What does that do?
I don't think it reduces inequality. And I do think it means that we've overstated some of the generational problems. I don't think the biggest problem in our society is that millennials are terribly off, right? I think many millennials are going to be just fine. But I think when you think about the big problems that we have in our society, I think that actually as big a deal as that generational transfer is, I think it mostly leaves those problems where they are. I don't think it significantly worsens them, and I don't think it significantly improves them, because so much of our problems are across economic groups and classes, and by definition, generational transfers are within.
In your opening statement, you mentioned that the energy crisis in 1973 is one of the major reasons why the economic pie stopped increasing. But presently, the energy is less than 10% of the technology. The real game, the real economy, if you look at the technology company, they make more than almost 100 times more than the energy sector. So how can you say that the energy still has this braking effect on the American economy?
Oh, I think that, to me, the bigger thing was the effect that energy had back in 1973 and the sharp break that it represented. So energy is not as important today as it was back then, but energy is still a major part of most Americans' budgets. They spend a lot of money on gas. They spend a lot of money on heating their homes. They spend a lot of money on energy. And so energy costs still matter a lot, but I absolutely agree they don't matter as much as they did in 1973.
Hi, I haven't read the book yet, but I intend to.
Thank you.
It just came out like 2 days ago. So
Okay, good. I thought it was lacking. Could you speak a bit about your perspective on the need for significant investment in infrastructure to address climate change?
Yeah.
And the fact that that is probably going to need to be done by largely by governments.
So you just made the case for why the private sector won't always do investments better than I did in about 1/20th of the time that I talked about it. So thank you. I mean, climate change is a classic example of something that there's no individual company whose responsibility it is to address climate change, right? It's an externality. And so I do think that this bill that they passed, the one that's called the Inflation Reduction Act, includes an enormous amount of money for green energy. I mean, so much money that when I've talked to people about it, I've said, if you could get another climate bill how much more would you want to spend? And they've said, actually, that bill has so much money that that's not what we need right now. We actually have we now have a lot of the money that we need as an economy investing in climate change. It's absolutely crucial, mostly not for economic reasons, mostly so that our children and grandchildren can live in a planet that they can live on. But I think one of the issues now is, are we going to figure out a way to spend that money in good ways? And that is a place where I worry about too much regulation. There are lots of ways I worry about too little regulation, antitrust, unions. But I think it's going to be really important to say we can't spend 10 and 12 years doing environmental reviews before we build a new green energy plant. We just got to build some of this stuff. And so I think now some of the bigger risk is not the money in that one area. It's, can we actually get it done? It's implementation.
I think a question here in the middle.
How do you think about universal basic income as a strategy to address inequality? If you think it's a good idea, then what sort of constraints or guidelines would you put around it? And so what are the unintended consequences you think about?
Yeah. So I don't talk about universal basic income in the book. But I've thought a lot about it. I don't talk about it because we haven't had it in this country. Actually, there's a very brief part of it. George McGovern in 1972 had part of his policy that was a universal basic income. He didn't use the phrase. And it was so unpopular that Richard Nixon hit him over the head with it again and again and again. And it was part of Nixon's landslide victory in '72. I'm pretty skeptical of universal basic income. I think I believe in the idea of work. I think it gives people meaning in their lives. I think it's important to set a baseline particularly for children. So a universal basic income for children, which is basically child tax credits, I think are a very good policy, and we've seen it have success. But I don't think that you have a flourishing society where you basically are paying people not to work. And there are a lot of exceptions to that. Children are exceptions to that. People who are taking care of young children are exceptions to that, and we're really a horrific outlier in how we treat full-time parents in this country relative to other countries. But when you run the math, in any realistic way, a universal basic income wouldn't be that much money. And I still believe enough in the idea of work and the idea of people going and doing something that has meaning and being with other people that I would much rather see a highly progressive tax system that makes sure that any job someone has gives them a decent wage than a universal basic income.
You're all asking such good, concise questions. This is like a role model for an audience.
Hi, guys. Thanks for this. I'm going to sound more like a boomer than the token 23-year-old in the room when I ask this. But the deficit is a huge problem.
Yep.
Huge. And please don't say we're just going to increase taxes, because we know we have to do more than that. How do you think about that in the context of calling for more spending?
Yes. So I think we should make a whole bunch of our social programs less universal and more progressive than they are now. We now in this country often have the government spend more money on affluent old people than on poor children. I don't think that makes sense. I understand why they designed those programs as universal. FDR, it was a political decision, not an economic decision. He was very explicit about that. FDR was a better politician than any of us, or at least than me. But things change over time. And I think right now in our economy, we have a whole bunch of benefits that flow to relatively affluent people in a very unequal society. And I want to say by affluent, I don't just mean the top 1%. I mean the upper middle class. We have a lot of policies that benefit people who fall into that group. I also would raise taxes. Our taxes are historically low. They're lower than a lot of other countries. But it doesn't just have to be tax increases. There are a whole bunch of ways we can cut spending. It's great. You guys are getting, I guess the book has a whole bunch of my conservative views as well, but you're getting out some of my other conservative views. I would not sharply cut military spending. Look around the world today. I don't want to live in a world with a weak America.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Okay.
Thanks so much for this. Just as an aside, I just came back from Rome, and going into Rome, it took less than 4 minutes to go through immigration as a non-European. And I landed in Terminal 1 at JFK, and it took 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
Just information. But I wanted to ask you about education. As someone who's been in education for most of my adult life, I feel like there was, maybe you can answer this, I feel like there was something deliberate in the 80s when Reagan, et cetera, defunded education, and that there was something a little nefarious about it in terms of the issues that we have now, especially upper level education.
So education was absolutely there have been a lot of cuts to education spending. Sometimes they're sneaky because they just fail to keep pace with inflation, or they fail to keep pace with enrollment, but those are cuts to spending. That's mostly not at the federal level. I mean, if you just think about who is running education, it's overwhelmingly local and state. And the federal government does some education spending, but I think the blame is more on states than it is on the federal government. And one of the things, the United States, even before the 20th century, had this really glorious tradition of mass education. More than any other country in the world. We had the first universal high school movement. In Europe, people in Europe said, we don't need to educate our workers. They don't need to learn to read. They're just going to be workers. And the United States said, we're going to educate our workers. I tell the story of Willa Cather, who's an example of an early generation of universal high school in Nebraska. And then we did the GI Bill, and we built in places like California these incredible university systems that educated this incredibly diverse state. I mean, it's such a shining example of what America can be, the Cal State system and the University of California system. It's so diverse, it's so good, and we've been starving a lot of it of funds. And money's not everything in education. I think accountability matters as well. But money's a lot. And when you think back to the kind of glory, the golden age of American schools, a lot of them were just local schools. So it's not like they were dealing with competition, but they had the investments that they needed, and they were truly excellent. And to me, the saddest thing is, if you're over 55 in this country, you're part of the most educated generation in the world. And if you're under 40, you're not. And so we've basically allowed other countries to copy our model of mass education, and we have lost faith in it, and that saddens me.
One footnote is, I forgot to say that it was Reagan defunding California's education.
That might be fair. Reagan was governor in California.
With the state. All right, well, I'm afraid that has to be the last question/point. David's going to be signing books with the new, improved, less grim title, and I really recommend it. It's actually, what we haven't gotten across is what an enjoyable read and how many stories and character studies are in it. And I want to thank all of you for joining the conversation, and
Thank
David
you, Jacob,
for
and
coming
thank all of you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Well done. Great.